It's really fun to revisit this piece because I wrote it almost 3 years ago now. So it's also fun to reflect on some of my learnings and evolutions since initially writing it. But in the beginning, the piece was kind of spurred in my interest in exploring pseudonymous identity. I majored in cognitive science in school, and my main focus area or theme that I was really interested in was the relationship between memory and identity and the way our memories kind of shape our sense of self or who we are. So after I left my job, I was working as a product designer at Uber at the time. I wanted to sort of carve out a space for myself on the internet that felt a little bit more cozy, a little bit more private, a little bit more clean slatey or fresh. And I had seen at the time like a bunch of alt Twitter accounts that were really fun to engage with, and I wanted to like try my hand at sort of creating my own mask. And it felt like a throwback to my older way of interacting with the internet. Something I talk about in the essay is like how my first experiences were like on RuneScape or Club Penguin or all these services where you're not so tied to your legal identity or who you are in the analog world. And it felt like throughout like college and becoming more of a professional that my digital identity had become increasingly shrunk and increasingly tied to the sort of like narrative trajectory of my analog self. So it felt like a new space, a new mask, a new set of clothing to explore some questions during a new chapter of my life. Something that I was meditating on in relation to this question is those memes that are like how my Instagram friends see me, how my Twitter friends see me, how my LinkedIn friends see me. And they're funny because of this huge gap in perception and how we present ourselves across these different Web2 platforms. So I think like each one of these Web2 social platforms has a certain set of affordances and ways that it asks you to be or ways that it asks you to present yourself. And I think that set of affordances that each one offers also dictates the kinds of relationships that you can have with different people in each one of those environments. So similarly to how the workplace affords a certain kind of relating and a church affords a certain kind of relating, these Web2 social environments also each carve out their own definition of what it means to have a friend or have a conversation. So they're extremely opinionated, I would say, and they sort of encode their philosophy of what it means to have friends or be in relationship with one another into the sort of like foundational user interface affordances, interaction paradigms. So uh, you're kind of putting on whatever their assumptions are about relationship when you use the platform.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's a degree to which I think you construct your identity in Web2 in deep relation to the specific platform. So in the way that, Twitter friends, Instagram friends view me, that it's a very much kind of interdependent relationship with the Web2 platform or the identity that through which you represent yourself. And I think it could be, I think, superficially reduced to a kind of directionality where Web2 identity kind of goes from the platform outward, whereas Web3 identity might be kind of constructing the identity more inward and then carried into platforms. Because I think with the Web3 model, there's the view that the kind of accursed word wallet that we've been using to represent Web3 identity basically can be ported from one platform to the next. So you can see your collection of assets. You can also see your interaction with different agents or entities across different platforms, and each context is slightly different. And also, you know that in certain contexts, certain aspects of your collection will show and certain others won't. So it's always funny to see the kind of blank NFT appear on OpenSea. But I think still it's this construction that you know that you can bring it to these environments rather than construct it on these environments. And I think at first glance that superficially looks like Web3 is almost kind of a closing down of that construction of identity. And to some degree it is, because your identity is persistent across platforms, but then also to some degree it opens up because you have one identity that's not only co-created with like one platform, but like really travels across many. So you have almost more of like an ecosystem for one identity rather than a kind of ecosystem of identities, but you can still have the latter too. So it becomes even more complex.
I think the other thing too that's interesting there is how when you're building up this Web3 identity more or less from scratch, it's so much more based on what you do or what you own as opposed to what you say. And there's this sense of like the identity being an emergent property of the actions that you take in the world that are like verifiable by others, as opposed to um, like speech acts that emerge from um, your own mind or things that you want to just say.
Yeah, and there's also another kind of argument for activity-based identity, often in private systems, of wanting to authenticate a user based on their previous actions or just on their ability to, say, sign a particular public key message with their private key. So that identity becomes like the act of being able to sign or the act of having particular history rather than the kind of stated or compliant identity that might be in Web2 platforms or more kind of traditional state-based identity systems.
One of the go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, so one thing which occurs to me, I think that Aaron and Kia have spoken really beautifully about some of the limitations of Web2 systems. It also seems to me that it is, in fact, the lack of a cogent philosophy of identity that demarcates the limits more than perhaps encoding their own idea of what friendship or relationship or conversation looks like. The default is almost always the lowest resolution and poorest rendition or representation of who we are and how we can relate. And when we encode in a cogent, clear and transparent manner our particular philosophical understanding of something like identity, then it becomes possible for others to inspect it and verify it. And it's really interesting to me because I think I'm aligned with what Kia is saying there about signatures and private systems, that in fact when one, for instance, broadcasts a transaction on something like a blockchain, it is indeed a speech act, right? But it is a speech act with very particular properties, one of which is verifiability. And that collapsing of economic action with linguistic speech act is a really interesting phenomena which enables a great deal of novel approaches to representing who we are in any given context. And one of the questions, Marv, if you'll allow me, is that I have for Aaron is, the story that Marv has read at the beginning of your essay here, and what you've been talking about in terms of the construction of an alt identity from scratch is really interesting as a contrast with what you began speaking about in terms of memory, cognitive science, and how memory relates to the construction of self. And yet, while there's wonderful and fascinating and beautiful science that speaks to those connections, it's still possible to like magic seemingly out of nowhere an alternative identity and write it into existence, as you so beautifully say. So like, how does the capacity that we have to like start from scratch with an identity speak to this notion of like memory and self for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that starting from scratch is actually kind of a misnomer, in the sense that even when I or anybody sort of goes to create an alter ego online, there's many ways in which the uh, shape of that identity is a little bit predetermined, or not necessarily predetermined, but the affordances of the platform kind of help to determine the shape that it can take. So, for one thing, like starting up a fake or an alter account on Twitter is like a very different act than starting one on, say, Instagram, because it's asking you to like perform this alter ego in a certain way, like in a way that's in accordance with the structural qualities of Twitter, whether it's like the short form nature of it or the way that it's encourages you to like self-reference and set your own thought or engage with others in a very particular way. So there's that kind of clay, like you're sort of, if it's like a piece of pottery that you're molding, you're picking up soil or clay, and tools that are provided to you by whichever platform that you're shaping the identity in. And then the second way that I think it's like not entirely from scratch is that oftentimes with these alter egos, what comes out is like the negative space of your public identity, or that which is being suppressed in other contexts or needs to come out in another form because it can't see the light of day in your typical experiences. So in that way, it's kind of drawing on the memory of things that have been had to be kept in the dark. And so it sort of emerges from that negative space as opposed to like from nowhere.
Yeah, that's great. In the interest of time, I'm gonna actually maybe. I wonder if I should skip the second excerpt and go to the third. Yeah, you all good with that if we keep moving along a little bit here?
Yeah, for sure.
For me,
Cool. Okay, yeah, so third excerpt. Digital masks are making the static and immortal soul of the Renaissance seem increasingly out of touch. In an environment of info overload, it's easy to lose track of where my ideas come from. My brain is filled with free-floating thoughts and are totally untethered from the humans who came up with them. I speak and think in memes, a language that's more like the anonymous manuscript culture of medieval times than the individualist Renaissance era. Everything is a remix, including our identities. We wear our brains outside of our skulls and our nerves outside of our skin. We walk around with other people's voices in our heads. The self is in the network rather than a node. The ability to play multiple characters online means that the project of crafting your identity now extends far beyond your physical identity. So for me, this passage gestures toward sort of like the limits of individuality and gets to the heart of this trend these days of, sort of like finding your community over discovering your quote-unquote authentic self. I'd love to know what you all think about how we can sort of conceptualize this production of selfhoods in the context of spaces that prioritize things like community, interdependence. For example, if we're truly communicating these days in a non-linear, pre-printing press-like way, what might this say about this cultural moment and where the self fits in? Like, how might that be reflected in our social behavior or our technical stacks? Any general comments too about the passage is fine too.
Do you want to start, Kia?
I'm going to think for a minute if you have something. Otherwise, I'll go. I think Yeah, I think one thing that's quite clear in identity creation online, but also in person, is of course that we kind of carry morsels of others with us, and morsels of ourselves are produced by others. And that in the same way that you aren't starting from scratch when you start an alt and kind of using the negative space, you're already kind of preformed by all of the negative space or positive space of others contributing to you. And I think that one of the kind of key paradigm shifts of potentially that I think would be very positive, that we could encourage through more Web3 tools is related to this. It's jumping ahead maybe a little bit in the conversation, but what interested me and prompted me to want to write about Web3 identity is just the idea that how we tend to approach state-based identity, or just identity in general, is very much like pinning your apparition to a specific form of recognition as an individual unit, and that unit can like operate and act in the world. And that with Web3, like, the kind of easiest example is looking at a multi-sig account, where basically you have multiple people who are signers and who execute the transaction. So it's like one contract address and one entity that represents the will of potentially, however many agents are willing to sign or configured to sign. But then also, if you even look kind of further to like the ecosystem of the technology, you have essentially like just a contract at its core that can be extended and changed in multiple ways. So you can have a kind of data feed from one system acting as an entity that could sign on a transaction. And what it really does is it's not about the technology itself, but more about how we practice social institutions, which identity is so tied to. And that social institutions and economic institutions as a form of social practice tend to really take the individual as like the agent that can enact, or the organization that can enact. And we see something like in between here, where it's really a kind of agential, amorphous ability to have different contract addresses act on behalf of many different types of agents and have many different abilities. And that really, like, in my opinion, will hopefully and can explode kind of an institutional paradigm that we're much more used to, towards much more granular ends and much more granular ways in which we kind of constitute ourselves. If that makes sense.
Yeah, does anyone want to share anything else or expand upon that?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I think one thing that this makes me think about is like, depending on the level of abstraction you're looking at, or like how zoomed in you are to any given system, something can appear to be like very coherent and singular, or it can appear to be plural. So, for example, with like our own bodies, if you zoom in far enough, it appears as though the body isn't one with itself. There's all these different organs and biological systems and bacteria and microbiomes in the gut, things like this that work sort of as a network. But then, of course, as selves or agents in the world, we can also act in ways that like unify this network and present as like coherent or singular. And I think the other thing that's like interesting and relevant here is the notion of legal personhood. And obviously this is something that people adjacent to DAOs are thinking about a lot. But what's so interesting about legal personhood is that it allows for many people to become one body. That's sort of implicit also in the word corporation. It's like corporeal, becoming a body, and that the ability to like act as one body among many people is what gives you a sense of like legal recognition or agency in the eyes of the state. What I think is interesting about the digital paradigm is the way that it kind of it feels like it tends towards pluralizing ourselves in the sense that we have like so many different inputs coming in from so many different places and so many different ways to represent ourselves. And you see this, I think, like on TikTok and YouTube, like this sort of mainstreamification of dissociative identity disorder as like a pathological version of it. But then there's just sort of the more playful, like fun experimental version of it where you think of yourself as more plural. And I was reading about sort of the difference between like the Western legal system, which assumes singular selfhood and tries to hold people, entities like responsible for actions because they're presumed to be stable across time, versus other like legal regimes where the self is more plural, and so that results in like a different sense of agency and legal responsibility and property if the self is not like a singular entity that persists across time. So I think all these like really basic mental models have huge second order effects when it comes to thinking about like legal responsibility and corporate personhood, and how they all tie together.
I think one little piece that I'll pick up on from that beautiful sharing is, and in fact the piece that you also read, Marv, is this notion that the self is in the network and not a node. Because I think that looking at this, for me, certainly having grown up in Africa, it is deeply reminiscent of a philosophy that is prevalent around here called Ubuntu, which comes from the Zulu phrase Umuntu Gumuntu Gabantu. It means a human being is only a human being through other human beings, and it touches on what both Aaron and Kia have written about in terms of relational identity within the network. I think that it's really illustrates nicely Kia's point that, you know, currently any identifying regime that we have, particularly in the Western world, is largely about pinning an apparition to some unit of recognition, which is a wonderful way of putting it. And when instead we think in more relational and reciprocal ways about how we identify and are identified by others, we can at once encompass the plural view from the relational network perspective and the singular view from like, how do I relate to myself? Moreover, it has very particular implications for practical systems in the sense that like one can, for instance, imagine writing a regime of contracts which grants powers for certain kinds of roles, grant powers for certain kind of actions to specific roles and not to people. These roles can be defined and encoded in clear and deterministic language, and it need not be about some particular person, some particular singular coherent identity across time that needs to step in order to press the button for that action, but it can be any account in a broad network which meets certain criteria can perform a given role if the context, if the require statements and solidity have been passed, for instance, but it's not limited, of course, to the EVM. So I think that thinking in this reciprocal Ubuntu-inspired way allows us to navigate with grace between plural and singular forms by thinking cogently and granularly about the nature of relationship, both with others and ourselves, that we enter into.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of the difference between an institution and an individual, and the way that institution can persist across time because it has roles or masks or affordances that any given individual can sort of plug into and create a sense of continuity that transcends just the individual who is playing the role at any given time.
Okay, so Rashank has a question from the chat. They say, does a remixed non-singular identity become overwhelming to the average person to hold onto and navigate? What do y'all think?
Mm.
Right. I think that's a good question. I think there's also something implicit in the, because maybe of the paradigms of the identity systems that we have, that when we look at kind of creating a new one within the affordances, both social and technical, that we have, we think of it, or the language that we have to describe it, as a new identity. Or I think in Aaron's piece is more a kind of alter ego, which may be more to the point. And I would say that, like, what is the threshold on which an identity becomes a new identity? So I think that for many kind of creations of what we would call new identities online, or perhaps even new identities in social systems, is actually just a creation of a space for a facet of an existing identity that has not been articulated fully enough. And I think that can be overwhelming to some degree. I also think it can be a therapeutic modality. And I think maybe it's more of a pathology of the system that we posit them as new identities, and that becomes overwhelming because we have to treat them as though they are different, when in fact they're kind of a view through a prism, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me personally, it becomes overwhelming when they remain private, and I think that was for me the urge to like externalize in some way these things that I like wanted to talk and think about, but maybe didn't feel comfortable doing so publicly. And like I talk a little bit in the piece about the relationship to like coming out of the closet, and I think it's relevant because like prior to coming out of the closet, it feels like holding multiple selves like inside of you, but only one of them is made public or available in relational context. And the experience of, which is kind of like what Rashink is asking here, it becomes overwhelming to hold on to and to navigate this feeling of splitness. And so the externalization or the coming out is very therapeutic because it's a kind of like, I think, integration in the eyes of others, and a sense of like a return to some kind of feeling of a center from which all these different selves are like extending from, as opposed to being sort of like split and uncentered or unsure where to find that sense of wholeness.
Yeah, there's a lot to say here, but I'd like to keep the conversation moving. I love it. I really love this conversation. I wish we could dwell a little bit more. Medium is the message kind of thing here. So yeah, I'm gonna get to the fourth excerpt here. This is from Kia. Actually, let me paste a link and I'll do the quote to what I'm about to read. Yeah, so this is from Kia, her Inventories, Not Identities piece. Supporting a wide range of use cases, blockchain-based accounts are manifold in their function, acting authoritatively as wallets, identities, and beyond in one platform. Since multi-signature accounts presuppose groups or identity collections as their primary unit, we have an interesting and as of yet underexplored form of composable identity in our hands. Composable identity approaches identity as inherently relational, providing modular tools for individuals, groups, and organizations to present themselves within technical systems. When we approach identity as an inventory holding multiple contexts, we can expansively navigate the highly varied use cases of a peer-to-peer web and reimagine what we are. By re-evaluating identity in our technical systems, we can also fundamentally remap agency in the political sphere to come. So, it's almost been a year, I think, since that essay was published. Kia, do you have any new observations or any new insights?
Yeah, it's strange because I guess how fast the discourse moves, or maybe doesn't. A year already feels like a very long time ago to have written those words, right. And I think it was basically also right before, like, it had started to some extent, but before kind of, Web3 became a litmus test, and NFTs particularly had a particular cultural spotlight. So now revisiting the post, it's very interesting to see almost like the beginning of the crest of that wave, the words that I had. I think they would be different now. I would say that one of my motivations in writing the piece is that I felt like at the time, and I still feel like this, that there isn't enough attention given to the potential negative sides of all of one's actions being public online in the way that they are with Web3 technical identities or inventories. And that in a way, writing this piece made it clear that very much your like inventory wallet avatar is a more immutable representation of your identity than we are used to, and that we have to be very considerate with how we approach it and how we think about it. And I wanted to emphasize the fluidity of identity as opposed to that what I see as the technical affordances of the system that emphasize a very, very clearly articulated action-based identity. And that I think there's potentially really poor affordances of that technical system that sees an identity's actions so rigidly. So by looking and trying to orient it more towards fluidity, the inventories term kind of came up, where you're a collection of your actions and your, let's say, resources and your interactions. And to connect it to something I'm thinking about more at the moment is I think many of us have recently read Dawn of Everything. And it's not a new example, but one of the examples that threads out the book is the idea of cultures with governance systems that actually change over time. So they change depending on context. It could be the needs of a given community, or they could change depending on season, which is a form of context based on, say a kind of hard winter where you've harvested and kind of take stock versus hunting or agriculture in the kind of summer months. And that actually the form of governance in certain cultures would basically shift at times from being potentially on one end autocratic to more anarchic, depending on the seasonal context. And even during these times, some different cultures, I'll post a link, people's names would change potentially based on season. And what I feel like is that, at least intuitively for me, I don't want to generalize out, but I do feel intuitively that like a certain fluidity identity and ability to transform and change, at least to me, feels a very important part of like the human psyche. And that we're building systems that don't take that into account. And I think that approaching like technical representations of identity as collections as opposed to representations is one way to preserve that flexibility that I think is so important to who we are.
Right, because it's not saying this is you or this is all of you. It's just this is a subset of the things that some part of you happens to like own or have or do.
Yeah, which often feel fundamentally arbitrary and also at their best and at their worst fundamentally societally oppressive based on identity.
For those of you who don't know, Andy also wrote an exceptionally beautiful piece about identity for Kernel that sort of weaves together Kia and Aaron's writings. Andy, I love how you frame the conversation on the interplay of reciprocity. Would you mind speaking about that a little bit?
Sure.
Just posted a link.
What Kia has said is really important, that when we conceive things in only one way, i.e. in this case like an action-based imaginary for identity, then it blocks us and it gets us stuck into certain kinds of political arrangements. And what is at the roots of Griebe and Wengro's work, and as she beautifully noted, it's not necessarily a new idea, and you will find it in many other, particularly indigenous writers, the most modern example probably being Robin Wall Kimmerer and Braiding Sweetgrass, that like when our mode of interacting with the world, when the things that we identify with and the ways in which we get read by those around us is premised first and foremost upon relationship, upon a certain kind of give and take, then it is possible to not just imagine, but create the kinds of systems which give us the political flexibility that we need to respond to the different seasons of life, whether that's actually the cycling of the Earth's seasons, or just different seasons in human relationality and societal needs. So the notion, for instance, that we should not be tied to one particular account's actions is a fascinating one. And I think Kia herself is very well aware of this really wonderful fact, right, of the HD tree, which sits behind each account, each public key in some keyring, which is a word that has been proposed as an alternative to wallets. And what fascinates me about that, right, is in the context of this conversation that like you have this hierarchically deterministic tree, so I can remember 12 or 24 words and encant them into some internet connected machine and have instantaneous access to not just identity but value and history along with it. And beneath that roots account there is a potentially infinite number of other accounts, all of which are deterministically linked to it, but which only I, with the seed, can find, right? And it is my choice to reveal the connection, the relationship between those accounts if I decide to. And that kind of speaks to Aaron's point about these can be integrative moments of therapeutic modalities. But Kia is, as always, like so on point about this, because when I reveal the connection between a given account and its relationship to my root account, that is revealed once and forever. And that kind of immutability is something that we need more cultural training and narrative grace in terms of bringing it to the forefront of our awareness. I think that it is somewhat attenuated by the fact that this HD tree is potentially infinite, right? And that you can spin up as many accounts as you like, but Aaron's piece and just his general writing points at this fact that there is only so much negative space, right? Like you can't, while it may be technically possible to spin up as many accounts as you want and develop the relationships between them, it's not necessarily within our psychological or emotional power. So it's a mixed bag from me on that front. But when we imagine things primarily relationally, hopefully there is more flexibility in our political ordering and in the ways that we use our tools and in the kinds of stories that we use to relate to them and to relate about them in the wider collective.
Yeah, I think it's also important that we not paint self-portraits and then declare ourselves to be the portraits rather than the painters, because ultimately all of these things are representations, they're maps, but they never fully capture or swallow that which is being mapped.
I so much agree with that. And also, I just realized I wanted to briefly address kind of one personal criticism I have of my own piece here, and also just one I've received is important. One is that I wanted us to get used to the idea of this kind of immutability of multiple identities, but I wanted to do it as a kind of interim measure, because I do fundamentally think that projects like NIM Penumbra, also the work of DarkFi Squad, to basically make anonymity, or actually a broader sense of privacy than anonymity, available at the protocol layer for individuals, is really what we should be supporting. So I'm hoping that this conception is more based on choice than protocol publicness in the future. So I see this as a kind of interim cultural need that we have to recognize, hopefully. Secondarily is that there was a question of kind of emphasizing too much pseudonymity in the piece, and looking at phenomenons like Q as potentially degrading political discourse and structure in the US, and not referencing the downsides of pseudonymity. But I think there's a nuance here, because what you have is a kind of pseudonymity that is public, at least for actions. So with Web3 systems, you have a kind of immutable record of actions. And that is very different than a kind of pseudonymous group that can't be placed together. And the threat to me there is actually more about privacy than it is about lack of accountability. And I don't think that kind of fluid identity systems are opposed to accountable identity systems. I think there's still a very strong ability to have fluidity of identity and responsibility that follows that fluidity of identity, and perhaps more so because you're seen as having more agency in what your identity is based on context. And in the examples of different cultures that did change names and governance systems, there was seemingly no issue of those kind of systems of accountability falling from one to the other. So I just want to say that, like, I don't think ethics is fully reliant on kind of state names.
All right, I'd like to get to the final portion here. This actually consists of two texts. I'll read both of them, the first one being the concluding paragraph of Aaron's piece. I thought this might sort of help wrap up the conversation we have going here. Okay. The default setting on social media platforms, a consistent, persistent, unified profile, enables and exacerbates this conflict. The singular profile incentivizes you to develop a coherent brand. In search of internet points and better algorithmic placement, you post only what your audience wants to hear. You become a caricature of yourself as you spiral deeper and deeper into performative self-parody. The algorithm pushes you towards performance and away from spontaneous interpersonal discovery. Before you know it, says Stan, listens to, you're complaining and being outraged about the same things day after day, criticizing those who confront you with perspectives that are hard to integrate into your performance, shutting down authentic relating in favor of crude brand management. Pseudonymous internet accounts are an escape hatch from this runway feedback loop. They give you the ability to explore and embrace your multiplicity. They teach you that your legal identity is also a kind of mask, an ever-evolving montage of loosely assembled parts. You can experiment with multiple identities and social graphs simultaneously. You can be multifaceted without being disingenuous. You learn to hold on to your sense of self a little more loosely and experiment with new ways of being. You can explore all the personalities that any human being may develop into, all the shapes and feelings that you could have been but aren't yet. Now, keep that in mind as I read this final excerpt, this one from writer and theorist Amy Ireland from the latest issue of Spike Art magazine, who writes about crypto as a subversion of the patriarchal authenticated system. If identity on Web 1.0 is a pseudonymous and inconsistent and identity on Web 2 is real named and consistent, identity on Web 3 is pseudonymous and consistent. The agents that it indexes are no longer validated by any of the criteria so integral to the representational regime of patriarchal visibility. Simply by playing the game, being on the chain, they become synthetic, post-human, and full of transversal potential. Web3 has the capacity to usher in a profound social paradigm shift because, among other things, it provides a totally novel notion of what counts as an agent, one no longer tethered to the male, the individual, or even the human. No, crypto isn't patriarchy's newest tech. It belongs to something far stranger and wilder than is dreamt of in man's philosophy. So as we start wrapping up this conversation, I'd love to just hear, just some concluding thoughts, what you all think about Web3 identity really is, quote unquote, or you think things are headed. Just any general thoughts would be great so we can wrap these things up.
I think that the interesting thing about the way identity is taking shape in Web3 compared to what I was describing in the alter ego Twitter piece is how much higher the stakes feel. How like people are not only crafting new identities, but they're also like sort of sacrificing their material resources at the altar of these new identities that they're creating. And that combined with what Kei was describing with the like immutability of these new altars or identity objects creates a whole new dynamic that is weirder and more intense than I think the kind of identity experimentation that was happening. I also want to just I think it's weird as things evolve to see how flattening the term Web 2 has become, because like a lot of what I was interested in writing about before all this this Web3 conversation started happening more in earnest was the really interesting like subjective and phenomenological differences and the different psychological experiences that are possible across all these different Web2 platforms. So I think it's kind of a mistake to say that Web2 identity is like one thing that can be compared to Web3 identity, because the internal experience, I'm not talking about like the single sign-on, like the outside in view of what the identity structurally is like. I'm talking about the psychological experience of what it feels like to be a self on each one of these different platforms is vastly different from each other, and also from whatever you can experience like as a wallet. So I think that's also important to keep in mind as we try to navigate these identity territories, to focus the subjective experience and not just the structural affordances.
Andy, Kia, do you want to have a say or expand upon that, or final parting thoughts? We're running up on time here, so I'm just trying to be mindful about everybody's time.
Sure. I'll be really quickly just to say that it's characteristically nuanced and insightful from Aaron, and that one of the critical features that holistic and healthy approach to both self-identification and identification in society requires is the move away from automatically demonizing others. We have this almost evolutionary tendency to group, categorize, and denounce that which doesn't align with our own interests, perspective, or mode of being in the world. And it happens a lot with this term Web 2. We think that we can kind of use it as some kind of shorthand signifier for that which is past due, which is no longer useful. And I think that Aaron has done really well to remind us that the psychological feeling of being itself in various different environments is still deeply relevant, and is something that we can learn a great deal from as we continue to explore different kinds of inventories and this expansive navigation of multiple different contexts that Kei talks about. So it's been a privilege and an honor to participate in this. Thank you so much for hosting it, Mom, and Aaron and Kia. It's genuinely a privilege. I'm so grateful to be here.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andy and Aaron. And thank you so much, Mark, for facilitating. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, of course.
I guess,
Oh, go ahead.
no, I guess my parting feeling is that I think because I'm so kind of feeling on the ground floor and in the weeds of building these technical systems through my work, that tends to be the point at which I start and kind of break open concepts at the moment. But I would say that my enduring belief is that most of these technical systems in their current form may not exactly endure, but what may endure is different cultural patterns and social institutions that inherit the patterns of the technical systems in a space that has strangely higher, accidentally higher stakes than other technical systems I think that we've seen before. And that what I hope is that different cultivated cultural patterns can be kind of embraced by different political, social, and economic institutions over time, rather than the technical systems themselves becoming the kind of progenitor of the change.
Totally.
Well put. I think that's a great spot to end this on. This is such an incredible conversation. Thank you all so much. Aaron, Andy, Kia, really appreciate you all, and thanks for sharing your thoughts today.